Martin Luther King is a threat to neoliberalism. And I know that sounds like a weird thing to say because neoliberals love to invoke the memory of Martin Luther King when they want to shut down anybody who is too radical for their tastes. But not only was Martin Luther King a crusader in the fight against racism, but he also fought poverty, militarism, and materialism. As a symbol to everybody who's fighting to make the world a better place, he was such a threat that neoliberals had to whitewash his history and amalgamate him into the right-wing consensus. Because the arbiters of American politics want to make sure that American history is told from the perspective of elites. And turning Martin Luther King into a part of the voice of the elites might be one of the most insulting things I can imagine to his legacy. It's so bad that I worried about making this video because invoking the name of Dr. King is almost verboten. It's almost cringy, which sucks because Martin Luther King was much more radical than history typically paints him as. In all honesty, screw them. This video is going to be about Martin Luther King, especially about his last crusade, a fight for economic justice for all Americans. This is the story of the Poor People's Campaign and on the legacy of Martin Luther King. Hi, I'm Tristan Johnson. This is Step Back History. Please subscribe, hit the bell notification, and if you're feeling inclined, I have a Patreon that helps make this entire thing go. The idea of the Poor People's Campaign began back in 1966. Only 3 years after the March on Washington, his idea would be to bring the poor people of America to Washington, D.C. into a place where politicians couldn't just ignore them, and bring up the very real issue of the fact that America is an extremely unequal country and people are in extreme poverty. Even in the 1960s, when inequality was a lot lower than it is today, it was still pretty bad. He was inspired by the tireless activists who brought about welfare in America. And so to make this ambition a reality, he went to the Southern Christian Leadership Conference, the organization that he headed. In various discussions, they decided to expand the definition of their civil rights fight to encompass economic justice. Should also mention, though it's not really important to this video, opposition to the Vietnam War, which was going on at the time. And also the Johnson administration, the architects of the Great Society, were starting to abandon their fight on poverty in order to double down and focus on Vietnam. What the SCLC decided to propose was something called an Economic Bill of Rights, a set of laws or possibly even constitutional amendments that would make sure that nobody in America goes hungry. MLK around this time also announced a transition from reform, like he had been done in the 1950s, 1960s, to revolution. Still committed to nonviolent activism, he declared that this was a moment of fighting instead of for civil rights, for human rights. And so he imagined that instead of being a safe, tame protest, that this was going to be an act of mass civil disobedience. Explicitly nonviolent, but militant. And they planned to march on May 2nd, 1968. The Poor People's Campaign was announced on December 4th, 1967. And the demands for the Poor People's Campaign were not vague. They wanted $30 billion set aside to fight poverty. They wanted job guarantees. They wanted a guaranteed income. And they wanted 500,000 units of low-income housing built every year. Media coverage, like everything Martin Luther King talked about at the time, was overtly negative. And instead of talking about the policy proposals or anything to do about, actually making a change, they decided to critique the tactics and the results of various different protests around America, no matter how connected they were to King or the SCLC. To promote this event, he went on a tour around the American South. One notable story that brought King to tears was when he visited a small town in Mississippi and talked to a school teacher who, for lunches for kids who couldn't afford them, was giving them basically a slice of apple and a few crackers to get them through the day. In anticipation of these poor people coming to Washington to insist on the basics of living, the United States and the Johnson administration was prepared essentially for a violent takeover of the government. To oppose King and people fighting for food and homes and jobs, he activated 20,000 military soldiers. What other kinds of soldiers are there? I guess Congress people spoke out anticipating that this was going to be a violent riot and how they were afraid of all these poor people coming to, again, assert their need for jobs and food and homes. One Democratic senator called to censure any politician who supported the Poor People's Campaign, saying they should not bend the knee to the poors, and that if need be, Congress should go to another city where they do enforce the law. And this was also an election year, and Richard Nixon, who would end up becoming president, spoiler alert at the end of the year, called out saying that the campaign was terrible, and he was calling to Congress to make sure that nobody bent when it came to helping poor people. And of course, we can't talk about Martin Luther King existing and trying to make the world a better place without talking about the number one group of people who did everything, including possibly murdering him, to stop any sort of racial or economic justice for Americans, the FBI. They had a program called COINTELPRO, which I think should be its own video, but one of the many things COINTELPRO, which was basically a project to subvert and tear apart any left-wing movements in America. This is why there's really no left-wing party in America. And specifically, they were really interested in trying to destroy the career of Martin Luther King. They started trying to spread rumors that he was a communist, even though he maybe said behind doors that he was a socialist. And if you look at his positions, the closest thing he could be called is a democratic socialist, more of a Bernie Sanders than a Fidel Castro, if you will. And of course, under the auspices of stopping the civil rights movement, the FBI also was watching and monitoring and collecting information from poor black communities around the United States. In order to fight the Poor People's Campaign specifically, they tried to sow rumors that it was going bankrupt, and also tried to intimidate people from going, claiming that if they showed up and protested, that they might lose their welfare benefits, which, you know, for a thing called the Poor People's Campaign, could be quite the threat. And further to fight the Poor People's Campaign, they worked with a fascist, racist organization known as the John Birch Society, again, a video for another time, in order to sow rumors that the entire civil rights movement was, of course, just a communist plot. But while the Poor People's Campaign was starting to move into action, a huge issue would break out in Memphis, Tennessee, that would show exactly why such a campaign was needed. Memphis, Tennessee was a city where the civil rights movement had limited penetration. It was a city that was largely still segregated, and it had very low workers' rights, especially for people in the public sector, especially in jobs that were heavily worked in by black people. In the history of Memphis, there was some attempt for black workers to unionize under the New Deal, but after World War II, in the name of anti-communism, a lot of advancements made by workers in the labor movement were intentionally attacked. But this event focused on sanitation workers in Memphis, who were almost entirely black. To be a sanitation worker in Memphis meant that you were working under dangerous conditions with not very many worker protections and very low pay, to the point where many people who were working full-time as sanitation workers were either on welfare as well, or they had to pick up second jobs. And a lot of them also lived in public housing. In Memphis, workers could be fired without cause, and they had tried to strike in the past. In 1963, there was a strike in which nothing was accomplished and 33 sanitation workers were just summarily fired. There was another strike attempt in 1966 where the city stepped in and threatened to jail all the leaders of the strike. So on February 1st, 1968, Ethel Cole and Robert Walker, two sanitation workers, were crushed to death in a garbage compactor. And this was not the first time that sanitation workers had died this way. So logically, the workers called upon the sanitation department to fix the faulty equipment, and they refused, so the workers went on strike. The city hired strikebreakers who worked with the cops, and because this was exactly in line with what the Poor People's Campaign was about, Martin Luther King openly expressed solidarity with these workers and even came to Memphis to visit and, show that he supported these people fighting for just basic safety measures. At this point, Martin Luther King was a celebrity, so a whole bunch of students came and there was a massive demonstration of people when he arrived. Something like 20,000 students came to express solidarity with the sanitation workers. And in response to this strike, this peaceful demonstration to try and, get themselves some safety and maybe some, basic increases in their quality of life, the police responded by using tear gas and by viciously clubbing the protesters. In the chaos, the police murdered a teenager by the name of Larry Payne. And of course, the press responded to this brutal use of police violence on non-violent protesters by blaming the protesters. Given my previous video on the Greensboro massacre, this probably shouldn't be that surprising. And because Martin Luther King was there, of course, they roped in the Poor People's Campaign and tried to further this narrative that the Poor People's March on Washington that was coming up soon was going to be a violent riot and a hostile takeover of the federal government. After this horrible act of violence on April 3rd, Martin Luther King left Memphis to go back to a hotel to kind of regather and regroup and try to do another day of solidarity to hopefully make more progress. And while he was there, he gave his famous "I've been to the mountaintop" speech.
Well, I don't know what will happen now. We've got some difficult days ahead. But it really doesn't matter with me now, because I've been to the mountaintop. I don't mind. Like anybody, I would like to live a long life. Longevity has its place. But I'm not concerned about that now. I just want to do God's will. And He's allowed me to go up to the mountain. And I've looked over and I've seen the promised land. I may not get there with you, but I want you to know tonight that we as a people will get to the promised land. So I'm happy tonight. I'm not worried about anything. I'm not fearing any man. Mine eyes have seen the glory of the coming of the Lord.
And the day after he gave that speech, he was looking out a window on a balcony talking to Jesse Jackson, and he was shot in the throat. Martin Luther King was rushed to a hospital where he died. The person arrested in connection with this murder was a guy named James Earl Ray, who confessed to the crime, but then later recanted his confession. King's family to this day are still convinced that this was not just the work of a lone gunman, but was an assassination on behalf of the FBI. What I think says a lot that, while they would need a lot more evidence in order to make this case, it's not surprising if they did. The FBI was trying to convince Martin Luther King to commit suicide at one point. They were doing virtually anything possible to stop a movement for economic and racial justice in America. And so I would be completely unsurprised if in the future we found out the FBI did indeed murder Martin Luther King. I mean, now it's not even abnormal for the US to extrajudicially kill their own citizens. MLK's assassination was obviously a massive blow to the Poor People's Campaign. And in honor of him, his casket was actually pulled by a mule-drawn wagon. Part of his vision of having the Poor People's March on Washington was having people coming in on mule-drawn wagons to insist on their humanity. But leaders in the campaign did try to rally the movement. They put together an economic bill of rights, a thing that all Americans should have the right to. The first was employment at a living wage. The second was income for those who can't find or are unable to do a job. The third was that all Americans should have access to land for economic use. The fourth was access to capital so that poor people and people of color would be able to raise the finances needed to start businesses. And last, fifth, the most dangerous of all for America, the ability for average, normal people to play a role in the decision-making of the United States. So the campaign began on May 12, 1968, led by Coretta Scott King, Martin Luther King's wife. On the National Mall, they built a shantytown, a tent city, which they nicknamed Resurrection City. And for 6 weeks, the Poor People's Campaign occupied this area, refusing to move and insisting on their economic justice. The movement would then suffer another blow as Robert Kennedy, another vocal supporter of the movement who was running for president, was assassinated during this 6-week period. And then on June 20th, Washington police evicted the camps using tear gas. To this day, the Poor People's Campaign is considered largely a failure. The only real legacy it has right now is that there is a group, a socialist group in Savannah, Georgia, which helps people in poverty that uses its name as part of its story. And really it was an attempt for a true workers' movement. And at the end of the day, it was ended by oppression and state violence. And even their liberal allies, like the Johnson administration, eventually turned on them when it came to talking about class. The main point of this story is to know that the state is never going to be your ally. It is an organization designed to entrench the powerful and help them maintain their privilege and power over others, and they will never, ever give that up willingly. And as soon as you're considered an actual threat, they're going to use everything, including violence. And in one final horrific act of abuse, the history of this radical fighter for the people has been whitewashed. Now Martin Luther King is invoked in discussions in order to attack people who are protesting in a way that they don't like, or pushing for things that they think are too much because they threaten the privileges of the obscenely wealthy elite. Both Democrats and Republicans in America have weaponized this whitewashed history of Martin Luther King in order to attack people who are fighting for social justice, for racial justice, for economic justice, for everybody. So don't let them. Fight, shout, demand your rights as a human being, and never, ever, ever give up. Keep fighting every day for Black lives, for Indigenous lives, for women's lives, for LGBTQ plus lives, for human lives. Don't stop fighting.